Hello, welcome to Fuller Exegetical. Today, we're going to be talking about Genesis 1 and 2, young Earth creationism, and a whole mess of issues related to that. So being that this is my first video, why am I here? Well, I wanted to make a place where I can talk about all kinds of things related to biblical interpretation, how to read the Bible, what it actually says, and talk about some common interpretations. Are those good interpretations? Are they not? All those sorts of issues. And today we're going to be starting a series on Genesis 1 through 11. Those chapters in particular, because the early chapters of Genesis are cited and are kind of core to the beliefs of young Earth creationism. And to specify what I mean by young Earth creationism, young Earth creationism is the belief, essentially, based on early chapters of Genesis, that, first of all, the universe is about 6,000 years old. And that date is arrived at by basically taking genealogies and ages of people in the early parts of Genesis, as well as the rest of the Old Testament, adding up all those ages, and you get to a date roughly about 6,000 years from the creation of the universe. So that's the first claim of young Earth creationism, and that stems from and feeds into a lot of the other stuff we're going to be talking about. That claim is also related to just the general idea that the early chapters of Genesis should be read what would be claimed as literally, or very much at face value. These chapters should be read as historical and scientific in nature, and that they're making claims about the scientific material origins of the universe and everything in it. Along with those two claims, especially with the age of the Earth, are issues with the theory of evolution. So young Earth creationists would deny the theory of evolution, say that it is false and unsupported, and instead rely on the idea of created kinds, which is to say that God created all the plants and animals, all the life that we see, in the basic kinds that we see it today. Now, life can adapt and change to an extent. What that extent is somewhat ambiguous, but may be able to adapt to an extent, but stays within what is called a kind. There are a lot of videos, books, all kinds of things refuting young Earth creationism scientifically, presenting the evidence for evolution and the lack of evidence for a younger Earth. I think that's all great material. I've watched and read quite a bit of it. And if I remember, I'll link some good resources if that's the kind of study you're wanting to do. What I want to do here is look at young Earth creationism and its claims from a biblical exegetical perspective. Does the text itself support this kind of a reading? Is it right to approach Genesis 1 through 11, Genesis 1 and 2 specifically today, looking for historical and scientific answers? I don't think so, and I'm going to argue for why. Before we get into why, I want to just open up with a bit of explanation for what I mean by exegesis. Exegesis is a word which basically just relates to the interpretation of a text. It has to do with going to that text and trying to understand its original and intended meaning, sort of getting past the surface level and trying to get at what this text is really saying, what the author really meant when they wrote all this down. Whether that be looking through literary devices, the genre, the history and setting of that text, all these things can play into exegesis, but at the heart of it, it's just trying to understand what any given text, not just a biblical text, what any text is saying. So as part of exegesis, I want to talk about historical critical method. Now, the historical critical method is somewhat self-explanatory in its title. It's basically criticizing a text by looking at the historical environment in which it was created and originally read. So you're looking at the culture, the politics, the economics, the environment that produced this text. What idioms and cultural aspects were included in this text? What common metaphors and images would the author have used, and how would the original readers have understood those images? Those are the kind of questions that historical criticism asks, and it attempts to answer those questions by looking at archaeological data. It looks at other texts from the time period. It looks at recorded history and all these different perspectives and voices which can speak to the world that the text was produced in, as well as how have other people read this text throughout history? Do we have records of what people from the time period or the time shortly thereafter were saying about this text? So why am I saying all this? Well, if you remember, I said one of the claims of young Earth creationism is that the early chapters of Genesis should be read literally at face value. And by literally, what we're saying here is just word for word, what it says is what it means. You don't go any deeper than that. So when you have all these genealogies with people and their ages and all these things, and you add that up, well, that's a literal time period that you can rely on. And when Genesis 1 says that God created the universe in 6 days, that's 6 literal 24-hour days, 1 literal week of creation. And that's how it's to be understood. And further, there's the idea that it should be understood that the intended meaning of Genesis 1 and 2 specifically is sort of a scientific account of how the universe and everything in it came into being. The intended message is of material origins. Now, I talk about that because it raises the question of, should Genesis be read in that sense as a sort of textbook on history and science? Now, that might seem strange at first, but remember, there's a lot of different kinds of literature, not only in the modern world, but throughout history. With poetry, we have fiction, nonfiction, we have mythology, we have apocalyptic literature, we have all these different kinds of literature, and they each need to be treated a little bit differently. If you read a poem as literal prose, well, you're going to run into some problems. Poetry, famously, contains both elements of the real and the imagined. Imaginary gardens with real toads in them. So if you approach a text with the wrong interpretive method, you're going to get the wrong answers, and you're going to ultimately be asking questions that text probably isn't even capable of answering. So when we're looking at Genesis and trying to determine how we should read it, we have to know what kind of literature is this? What kind of a text is it? Because we have everything from prose to history to parable to wisdom literature to poetry in Scripture. So we have to determine what we're looking at here. And I'm going to argue today, and a lot of scholars argue, that Genesis falls well into the category of ancient Near Eastern myth. Now, I've probably freaked a lot of you out by saying Genesis falls into the category of myth, and that really comes from, well, myths we all have about what the word myth means. In our modern colloquial sense, it means something that's false, fanciful, a fantasy, or a lie. But in the technical sense, when we're talking about interpreting a text, mythology is a genre, and it's not making a claim about the truth or falsehood of the work in that genre. Mythology is a literary genre that tells a story that explains the origin and the workings of the universe. It is cosmology. It is creation accounts. It is how does human and divine relationship work? How do humans relate to the world around them? What is the nature of that world? Those are the sort of questions we come to in mythology. So when I say myth, I'm not saying false. I'm just making a reference to the type of literature it is. And the fact that our mind immediately goes to this idea of myth means falsehood points to a problem in our own thinking when we're approaching Genesis. And that problem is this very scientific mindset that the only type of truth is historical and scientific. Whereas what Genesis is presenting, I would argue, is a theological argument within the framework of the common ancient mythology. So what is that framework of mythology? Well, in some sense it's broad. There were a lot of cultures in this region called the ancient Near East, and that time period spans a long time. So there's a lot of different creation myths, a lot of different literature around this, different pantheons, different ideas and philosophies. But there are also a lot of commonalities between all of these different stories. One of them is the overall shape of the world. Literally, the shape of things. So for the ancient Near East, the world is flat, basically a disk. It's actually almost like a snow globe, because over the top of that disk, you have a physical dome, the firmament. And what the firmament is it holds up the cosmic ocean above. Because for the ancient people, there's not only ocean around you, that's the waters below, but there's also an ocean above that's held up by the dome. That's where rain comes from, is sometimes this dome can let some of the waters through. That's controlled by the gods. What holds up the dome? Well, the tallest of mountains, of course. These big stone pillars hold up this, you could think of it as sort of glass, this somewhat transparent dome. And above that dome is the realm of the gods. Below the earth is the underworld of sorts. And again, that's one of these areas where things were viewed quite a bit differently between different peoples at different times. But there's the underworld, and then there's the chaotic waters, which is the literal sea, as well as this cosmic idea of chaos. So that's the shape of the world. I'll try and put up a picture of it if I can find one I can use. But think of a snow globe. And Genesis is operating within that framework. So there's two major ancient Near Eastern myths that I think are worth at least naming. I won't go into exhaustive detail of what they claim or what they say. The first is the Enuma Elish, which is a Babylonian creation myth. It's where Marduk creates the world and the humans, and he does so after defeating the chaotic god Tiamat, tearing her body in two, and with one creating the earth, with one creating the sky, and then from sort of the blood and viscera creating humanity. And specifically creating humanity as sort of a labor force to take on a lot of the difficult, menial, manual tasks that the gods didn't want to do. Humans were essentially slaves for the gods. The second one I want to talk about is the Atrahasis. It's an Akkadian myth, and here we have the goddess Mami creating humanity, again, from the blood of a defeated god. And humanity, again, is created to take on the work and the tasks that the gods don't want to do. Humanity's purpose is to serve the gods by doing this menial, manual labor. Those are the sort of creation accounts, creation myths, and ideas that Genesis is coming up alongside of. And in the face of these sort of ideas, though there are similarities, if you take a world religions class, you'll learn all about how similar some stories in Genesis are to these other stories, and they are. But the differences are key, and they're radical. Because Genesis is not just acting as one myth among many, it is acting as a counter myth to counter some of these ideas about humanity, the divine, creation, and exactly what kind of God we're talking about here. So to talk about some of those differences, in Genesis, God creates alone. We don't really see mention of other deities. There's no mention of violence in the creative process, whereas in these other myths, again, both of them, humanity and creation are involved in basically the aftermath of a battle and created from the remains of a dead god. We also see in a lot of these myths, there's this idea of sort of an antagonism between the gods and the forces of chaos, whether that be great sea monsters or other cosmic primordial forces. In the Genesis account, we don't quite see that. And in fact, we see, and I'll talk about this in a bit, specifically called out that God has mastered what these other accounts consider to be primordial chaos. Another difference is there's no origin story for God in Genesis. There's no genealogy of gods. This is the type of thing we'd call theogony, talking about where the gods came from. We don't have any of that in Genesis. And there's some theogony or genealogies to gods to more or less extent in the various ancient Near Eastern myths, but it's often there. And as I've already alluded to, a huge difference is the view of humanity in these texts. So in these other ancient Near Eastern myths, humanity has very little value and is seen really as slaves and servants for the gods. It's a very theocentric model for the universe, where everything exists to serve the interests and the good of the gods. In Genesis, we see humanity given incredible value in actually being an image bearer for God and participating in the creative process and having this noble function within creation as God's representative and image bearer to creation. It's a very different outlook, and it speaks a lot to the thought of humanity's place in the world and what kind of God we're talking about. So what is Genesis actually concerned with then, if we are to read it as myth? Well, it certainly isn't concerned with the material origins of the universe. In fact, without getting into any of this stuff about other ancient Near Eastern literature, just looking at Genesis 1 and 2 on their own terms, it's remarkably unconcerned with material origins. We see a great deal of shaping and ordering, but not a lot of discussion of where matter is coming from. We see in the beginning God is hovering over the deep ocean, over this deep chaotic dark. We see that the earth is formless and void, but very little discussion of where all this chaotic water, where this formless earth came from. Even when dry land is created, it's not created in the way we would think of it. The water is separated away and the dry land is revealed. Plants come forth once that happens, and fish and birds come forth within this expanse under the dome. There's very little discussion of what we would think of as creation, if it's things being brought out of nothing or material being made into other materials. Much more concerned with objects, material being given function within a system, being ordered from chaos. And the Hebrew term for creation is bara. That's what's being used here. It's used a lot of places throughout Scripture, and in a variety of ways, and often in ambiguous ways with relation to what it's actually referring to as creation. But often, it looks more like what we're seeing here, with something being given a function, being given purpose, being ordered, more so than something being brought into material existence. A metaphor for this would be when I built my computer. I had a pile of boxes of computer parts, and in a material sense, by that point I already had a computer. The material was there. But the creation happens when I bring all those together in an order and manner in which they can function. And that's the kind of creation we're seeing here in Genesis 1 and 2. Ordering and functionality. And looking at this, we can see that in the structure of Genesis 1. We have 6 days of creation. The first 3 set up the basic environment and order of the natural world. Day 1, God separates from the light from the darkness. Let there be light. And then there was evening and morning. We have a creation of time within this space, and a way to tell time, evening and morning, progression from light to dark. We have this dichotomy created, and now things can progress. Day 2, we have the creation of the dome to hold up the waters and the separation of the waters below from the waters above. Now we have a space, an environment in which the world, in which creatures can exist. Day 3, the waters below are gathered up together, separated away so that dry land can emerge. And now there's a place for life to begin, terrestrial life to begin. And not only does the dry land emerge, but now plants begin to grow on the dry land. So we not only have a place for people to live, but we have the start of food for people to eat. Plants they can grow, agriculture, all these things. So now we have the environment of the world. We have time, we have night and day. We have a sky, we have the waters above separated from the waters below, so we have this bubble of the snow globe where life can exist. We have dry land and plants growing, so there's a place for humans and terrestrial animals to exist, as well as food for them to eat. The next 3 days of creation, so 4, 5, and 6, we see the creation of entities and bodies within this environment, governing each of these spheres: time, the atmosphere and weather of this bubble, the waters, and the land itself. So on day 4, we have the creation of the sun, moon, and stars, all the lights of the sky, which govern, as it says, the day and the night. And this isn't merely a production of light, a luminescence. This is time telling now. So we don't just have night and day, we have months and seasons. We have festival times for worship. We know when to plant and when to harvest because the sun, the moon, and the stars provide signs to be able to tell the times, to be able to understand and predict the seasons. We have these lights of the sky now functioning and governing within this concept of time. On day 5, there's the creation of the birds, the fish, and the sea monsters. The birds and the fish are given the function to inhabit the sky and to inhabit the sea. They inhabit the environment created on day 2. But not just inhabit it, but to multiply and fill it. They also have the sea monsters, and that might seem strange, but it's a very deliberate inclusion. Because by saying that God created and ordered the sea monsters, is to say that God is not in an antagonistic relationship with these viewed chaotic forces that the other myths talked about. It's deliberately saying that God is master of these things, that they are merely another part of the plan, not something apart from or against God's design. It's making a statement about the sovereignty and power of this God we're talking about. Now we get to day 6, where we have all of the land animals being made. Again, inhabiting and multiplying within the environment created on the 3rd day, the dry land and amongst the plants, where these creatures can eat and exist and multiply. And we also have, and this can really be seen as the climax of this scripture, the creation of humanity. And importantly, the creation of humanity in God's image. In the ancient world, to be in the image of a god, really you should be thinking about like an idol. You know, an idol is made physically to look like and be in the image, but to be the representative of a deity in a space. And so to be in the image of God is to be God's representative within creation. This can be further seen with the command to humanity to rule over creation, to sort of take on this role of vice regent for God as a caretaker and representative of him. That places massive value on humanity above merely being slaves to take on the menial labor the gods didn't want to do. Instead, humanity is partaking in the creative process. When we look back over this creation story, so much of this is anthropocentric. The dry land comes forth and produces food in an environment where humans can live. The sea and the air is filled with birds and fish. Again, more food that humans can partake of. Humans are given a role in this world, yes, but not merely as slaves. The creation is set forth in a way that humans can enjoy. So with this structure, the first 3 days and the next 3 days, you can see each time a function is created, the function of time, and then something which functions within that space. The planets, the stars, the lights in the sky have a function within this idea of time and time-telling and seasons. We have the expanse, we have weather and water, the sea, and this entire environment. Then we have the birds and the fish, which exist and operate within that environment. We have dry land created and plants upon it which can be eaten. We have animals and people who exist within and upon that environment, function, and ones who function within. So that's Genesis 1, but I want to talk about Genesis 2 as well, because I think it really speaks to some of the issues with how can these chapters be understood. And one of those issues is pretty glaringly obvious even at a surface level reading, and that is that Genesis 1 and 2 are both creation accounts, and they don't agree. And they disagree in such a way that, to be frank, they can't both be read as literal, scientific, historical accounts. One maybe could be read that way, but that would be at the expense of the other definitely not being an accurate historical scientific account. What do I mean by that? Well, the creation order, first of all, is different. Genesis 1, humanity isn't created until the very end, and there's no impression given that men and women were created at different times. They were created male and female together. In Genesis 2, before there was rain or plants or anything like that, any animals, humanity was created first. And then the plants were created. The garden was planted and the man was put in it. And then the animals were created. And apart from that, humanity wasn't created all as one, both male and female. Actually, the woman was created after everything else. It just doesn't add up. And these might sound like small, nitpicky details, and in a sense that's true. But if we're to understand this as an accurate historical scientific account, well, it should all line up. The small details matter. If both of these texts are making their own theological and philosophical claims about the world, humanity, how humanity relates to God and creation, then these small differences are understandable because they are likely talking about different theological points. They're tackling different issues and approaching them in different ways. Genesis 2, under that mindset, it's making a point about the relationship between humanity and the divine. It's establishing humanity's role and function within creation. It's establishing how humanity should, could, will relate to God. It's setting up the environment and the characters for Genesis 3 and 4 to talk about sin and the shortcomings of humanity. It's making theological points, just as Genesis 1 was making theological points about how God created this good creation alone as one God, how God values humanity and actually puts their needs forward with creation and how it's all come together. It counters this idea of a violent God who creates from the blood of felled enemies and treats his creation as mere slaves. Before wrapping up, I want to tackle another issue here, which is the idea that creation is good. Over and over again in Genesis 1, we see, and it was good. In Genesis 2, we see that it is not good for man to be alone. And I want to talk about what does that goodness actually mean, because it's often portrayed and interpreted as perfection, as absolute perfection for creation. That in this initial state in the garden or in on day 6, that everything was absolutely perfect and in its ultimate form. But is that what we're really seeing here? The word here doesn't imply anything like that. It means good, pleasing, proper. And if we're looking at this in terms of God setting things in order, giving them purpose, meaning, and function, then that makes sense. To say it is good is to say it has its proper function. It is put together correctly. It works. It makes no claim of absolute perfection, that there can be no wrong, or that this is an ideal state of things. Which isn't to say it was still bad or chaotic. It is good. But I think, and we'll get into this in the next episode, that when we get fixated on this idea of absolute initial perfection, it can make interpreting Genesis 3 and 4, the rest of Genesis, difficult. And it can raise a lot of problems for it. I just want to highlight the fact that the claim the text is making is that it was good, it was functional, it worked and was put together well. And actually, in Genesis 2, what we see is a process of creation where God creates humanity and then creates the garden. And then, in a process of bringing man a helper, creates all the animals, has man name all the animals, and then that doesn't quite work, so then we create woman. Is a process, a working up towards the ultimate design, rather than this immediate initial perfection. And this is kind of what we see again and again playing out throughout Genesis, throughout the Bible, is this working out of God's plan. I think that's a better image of goodness. It's functional, it's working, but that doesn't mean there's not still working out and still an unfolding of the plan. So in summary, Genesis 1 through 11 is not a historical scientific text. It is functioning as a counter-myth within an environment of ancient Near Eastern mythology. It is using the common language, framework, and shape of the cosmos as the people who read it understood the world to make a theological point about God and humanity and how they are to relate. To read it as scientific misses this deeper meaning, misses the radical image of God who values humanity, mixes the strange idea of humanity being God's representatives in creation as vice regents who participate in the creative process, misses the point of a God who doesn't set things in motion and let them loose, but who's involved in working out and unfolding of the creative process. It misses all of that and substitutes it for this idea that it's simply an account of history, meant to counter evolution or the old Earth or any number of scientific theories that came about thousands of years after the book was written. And so much meaning gets lost in that process. I think it's very important to just take this text for what it's trying to say, because what it's trying to say is beautiful, it's huge, it's impactful. What it's saying is foundational. It is so impactful for so much of Christian theology, but you can miss that when you get hung up on this scientific, modern idea of what it has to be saying, of the kind of truth it is putting forth. And by asking the wrong questions, we miss the good answers that are actually there. So next episode, it's going to be Genesis 3 and 4. We're going to be talking about the fall, original sin, and what Genesis actually has to say about those common topics and doctrines. We're going to talk more about perfection as a concept and what Genesis claims about that. So I hope you'll come back and join me for that. If you think I missed something here, let me know. I'd love to hear about it. Anyways, thank you for watching. Hope you learned something. Goodbye. Future Matthew here. Just noticed as I was editing that there were a couple things that I wanted to cover in the video, but that I didn't go as in depth as I would like to. First one is just to explain a little bit more about what created kinds are, what the idea and claims there are. So the claim is basically that when God created life, he created it with this fundamental level of categorization, and that acts as a limit to how much life can adapt. So there's a dog kind, a cat kind, frog kind, elephant kind, I think. There's a lot of them. Generally at the family level, with traditional taxonomy, but not always. It, scripturally, they base that off the phrase, like in Genesis 1:24, where creatures are created after their own kind. And the claim is that that is making a statement, a scientific statement, that um, animals are bound to not change beyond that kind. That word in Hebrew really doesn't carry any special meaning, certainly not any scientific meaning. It means kind, like type, um, or a category. It doesn't have any taxonomical usage here or anywhere else. I also wanted to just real quick cover the seventh day of creation, because I realized I didn't mention that at all. And that's because that holds maybe less significance to the actual claims of young earth creationism, but it's still exegetically and theologically very important. And when we see God rest on the seventh day of creation in Genesis 1, um, that relates to creation essentially being God's temple, because where's the place where the divine rests? Well, God rests in that God's temple. And so when Genesis 1 is claiming that God rests here and it's telling that as part of the story, it's saying all of creation, the world has been inaugurated as God's temple, and he is present in his temple, and he rests in his temple, not elsewhere or far away above the cosmic ocean, but here and present and with us. Significant. It just didn't have as much impact to the age of the earth, so I missed it on the first pass. Sorry.